Welcome to Pennsylvania Newsmakers, and as always, thanks for watching. Well, the governor takes a loss on open records. Why is that important to you? Stopgap funding fails, and then the Pennsylvania Medical Society weighs in on medical marijuana. All that follows these words.
This is Pennsylvania Newsmakers, a fast-paced, unrehearsed weekly discussion with and about the leaders who shape your world. And now, here's your host, Terry Madonna.
Well, big news in Pennsylvania politics this week. Governor takes a big loss on open records. Why does that matter to you? We have two of the state's leading journalists to weigh in on that. John Micek, he's the editorial page editor of the Harrisburg Patriot News, PennLive, and Pete Muntean, he's the Capitol reporter for WGAL-TV, News 8. All right, Pete, let's start with you. Open records. What was this case about? The Supreme Court said that what couldn't the governor do?
Well, the governor got taken to court by essentially this guy named Eric Arneson. He was the guy who was fired on Governor Tumulf's second day in office, a so-called midnight appointee, put in this office of open records as the director. He's the guy who really crafted the state's most recent open records legislation, the right to know law.
Right.
And so the Senate Republicans essentially fronted Arneson the money to go to court. And the Supreme Court finally said that Arneson could stay in court, that Wolf overstepped his bounds in firing him. So the governor did take a big hit here. We saw some cryptic some messaging from the governor's office to say that, you know, we look forward to working with Eric Arneson now. So they're kind of doubling down a little bit now that the court has sided against
John, you were a reporter, now you're an editor.
Yeah.
Tell the folks, why should, records, why should they care about it?
Well, I mean, what's key here is the Office of Open Records is basically charged with ensuring that the public has access to public records, right? So that
which is pretty
important, right? So that you or I or anybody can walk into their local township building or borough office and say, hey, pony up the financial records on X, or I want to see the police report for such and such. I mean, there are reasonable exceptions for safety and security and stuff, and that kind of embedded in the law. But more importantly, Terry, what this Supreme Court decision really got to was a determination in law that the Office of Open Records although Mr. Arneson's appointment was a political one, the office itself is independent and therefore should be immune from the whims of politics. Eric made the perfectly credible argument in legal papers that if the governor can fire the director of open records at will, then that means it would have a chilling effect on the office's activities. Because what if, just for instance, they handed down a decision that went that went wrong for the administration? Could that person then be reasonably removed for not hewing to the party line? So this finding that the office is fundamentally independent is pretty important.
And you and I were both in court when they started the opening arguments, and that was back, I guess, earlier this year, in March,
somewhere around there.
And so the biggest keystone in this whole argument was that Arneson's appointment would be for 6 years. It's not supposed to run concurrent with a gubernatorial term, therefore adding to the independence of the office.
That's why they structured it that way.
That's right.
So
exactly. I mean, the office's first director, Terry Madonna, stretched across both the Rendell and Corbett administrations, for instance.
All right. The other question, I mean, as John, you accurately point out, there are items in the public records that are protected, things that rightfully should be protected. What's to prevent I'll use this term, probably the wrong term, a gadfly from just going into a small municipality and demanding umpteen thousands of documents? Well,
there's language in the law that actually that makes people pay for reasonable copying costs and labor costs. So if the local gadfly walks in and says, "Give me 18,000 pages of documents," they can reasonably say, "Well, that will cost us $400 to duplicate, and you're on the hook for it."
Yeah.
So, like for instance, Terry, when all of these so-called porn emails in the Attorney General Kane case dropped.
And there were thousands of them.
Of them. One of our reporters, Christian Alexanderson, went in and asked for copies of them, and we on the spot there we had to pay copying costs of like $400.
Wow.
So there are.
That's reasonable when you ask for that many copies, right?
Because that's a lot of paper. It's time for somebody to press copy over and over again. But
sometimes they'll be waived for reporters because we're in the interest of informing the public.
But I mean, the law is structured in such a way that where if somebody with an agenda walks in and is trying to, prove a point,
All right.
some securities.
We couldn't have a Newsmakers show or all these other commentary programs in Pennsylvania if we didn't talk about the budget.
Oh, God.
And this week, the Senate tried to override the governor's veto of the stopgap legislation. and the appropriation. That would just fund the state, all the operations, at basically the same levels that they were last year.
Right.
No
Paying
increases.
Back the organizations that haven't been paid since July 1st.
Yeah,
so
got it.
This would have gotten money to struggling schools, to human service agencies like rape crisis centers, like domestic violence resource centers. Then it would have been without that money since the impasse began. And the Senate tried to pull it off again, and it was a party line vote. So
partisan again.
In a way, it shows that there's not enough support. They need a 2/3 vote to override this Wolf veto. He vetoed the stopgap last month.
Yeah.
So they just don't quite have the support, and no partyman, none of Wolf's partymen, switched sides.
Yeah, I mean, if there's anybody surprised by this, I've yet to meet them. I mean, this is a largely pro forma exercise, and adding sort of a dose of humor to it. The Senate passed a motion for reconsideration after the bill went down, which basically means they put it back on the calendar again.
If they could round up the votes.
So they could call it up for vote, and for all practical purposes, what that means is they can hammer some Democrat for voting 3 times against schools, or however many times they pull it back up.
All right, we're going to take a break, and again, what would one of these programs be like if we didn't talk about the Attorney General Kathleen Kane and her continuing travails? Do I got that right? We'll be back in a moment.
This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is presented by the Pennsylvania Chamber of Business and Industry, the statewide voice of business. This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is brought to you by the Pennsylvania Highway Information Association, the go-to source to learn about transportation projects and issues. Please visit pahighwayinfo.org. And by the Pennsylvania Manufacturers Association. Business in Pennsylvania is our business.
I'm talking with John Micek and Pete Muntean. Both John's an editor, Pete's a reporter. They both cover the Capitol. John writes a lot of great editorials in the Harrisburg Patriot News PennLive. I encourage you to catch up on them. All right, John, before we leave this topic, there's always one more little piece to this.
Of course.
Senator Costa, the Democratic leader in the Senate, admitted Monday at the press club, last Monday at the monthly press club, that there would be no substantial tax hikes, which probably rules out the income tax. Well, if they're not going to do substantial tax hikes, what's keeping them from a deal?
That would be Governor Tom Wolf, who as recently as yesterday, in the wake of this stopgap vote and released by Auditor General Pasquale, says they still want to address this state deficit in a serious way. They've not moved off some form of substantial recurring revenue. To them, that means the PIT. And Terry, it's like one side is speaking ancient Greek and the other side is speaking ancient Egyptian. There's just no meeting of the minds.
Yeah. All right, let's get to Kathleen Kane. This week, the State Senate took some pretty dramatic steps using a provision of the state constitution, Article 6, Section 7. I want our folks to know I checked this in the Constitution. That's been only used once in 1891, not successfully. What did they do, Pete? What did the Senate do that puts Kathleen Kane, back in the news?
They've formed this bipartisan committee about whether or not, really, they can impeach her. There are 3 Democrats, 3 Republicans. We now know the committee members. They're from all corners of the state, pretty much. And they're going to come out with a report by Thanksgiving, the day before Thanksgiving. So I guess we'll see how legislators respond to that one. So we're waiting on that, and we'll see where this goes. I mean, this is really their last-ditch effort at maybe getting Kathleen Kane out of office. It's been something that's been talked about for a while, but admittedly, it's a slow process, and Republicans kind of have a vested interest to keep Kane in office because she's a Democrat, and in a way, they probably kind of want to run her again.
Yeah, well, John.
It's
I know you're sitting there smiling.
It's just a car crash. I mean, let's face it. I mean, this is seldom employed thing. There's no process sketched out. It's like one sentence in the state constitution that you can remove an officer for extraordinary cause or whatever the heck.
Reasonable cause.
Reasonable cause. I think by a 2/3 vote of the Senate. So this committee is going to go through its paces, study the circumstances, come back to the Senate with a recommendation, and then the Senate in turn will act or it won't. Every time, Terry, you think that this case involving Kane can't get stranger, it finds a way to get stranger. As we sit here taping Our friend Brad Bumstead from the Tribune Review has reported that the senior judge in the grand jury case has now accused Kane and her agents of breaking into his office in 2013 and making off with confidential documents.
Oh my gosh.
It gets stranger and stranger all the time.
Yeah, and there doesn't seem to be any end in sight. I mean, we still don't have a trial, Pete, that's sometimes going to happen. Now, you know, we've had trials. We have trials that go on and on and on. Maybe it gets to trial in 3 years. We have some folks involved in the Penn State sexual abuse case that still have not gone to trial, and that's what, 3 years ago at least.
Now, right.
And that's not been resolved.
I guess it'll be interesting to see what happens first, if there will be impeachment hearings first, or if Kane will go to court. It's a multi-pronged battle that she has to fight now. We're talking in the legislature and in the judicial branch, too.
And I guess we are waiting. The big news is whether a major candidate emerges to run against her in the primary. And I don't think we're talking out of turn when we say that one likely candidate would be a guy you covered in the legislature when he was there, Josh Shapiro.
Josh Shapiro, the current chairman of the Montgomery County Board of Commissioners. Yeah, he's been mentioned as a potential candidate. There's now a two-way race for the Republican nomination. John Rafferty from Montgomery County, who wanted to run in 2012 and kind of got muscled aside in favor of Dave Freed, the Cumberland County DA, who lost to Kane. And another guy called Todd Stevens, also conveniently a Republican House member from Montgomery County, who's also seeking the nomination.
Yeah. All right, the final question has to do with this whole business of whether, and this is a process question, but should the Senate stay in session? There was a big debate this past week about whether the Senate should go out for a couple of weeks because of the budget. But 50 people don't do the budget anyway.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, that's right. I mean, it's largely the leaders who are really meeting. And a lot of the meetings right now in the budget are behind closed doors without the governor. It seems to be the legislature trying to come up with their own plan to deliver something to the governor. They think that might be sort of productive, and the governor has really put it on them to bring something to him. So whether or not the rank and file really need to be involved, that sort of remains to be seen.
A deal.
Well, I mean,
and
particularly with the legislature having now borrowed money from various banks to meet payroll, having lawmakers standing around hoovering up per diems to the tune of something like $7,000 a day for the 2-week recess, and having zero impact on the process makes absolutely no sense.
But you have to admit, optically, people want to see lawmakers doing something.
They think they're not working if they're
when
not
I talk to people out on the street, I think
hear that all the time.
Right.
People can keep them in continuous session, and then try to explain to them that it doesn't matter if your local guy's there or not. I mean, that's the weird thing about this.
Yeah, I think. All right. Thanks for coming in. We'll see how long these stories continue, I think, for a while. All right. Pennsylvania Medical Society just recently adopted a position on medical marijuana with some caveats in it. We're going to find out what that's about. And then we'll get into a couple of other subjects back in a moment.
This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is brought to you by Pennsylvania Credit Union Association. Pennsylvania Credit Unions, where people are worth more than money. To find a credit union that is right for you, check out ibelong.org. And by the Energy Association of Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania's energy information source. This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is presented by the Hospital and Health System Association of Pennsylvania, working towards a healthy Pennsylvania, and by the Pennsylvania Coal Alliance, representing companies involved in America's most affordable, reliable energy source. To learn more, visit pacoalalliance.com.
Well, welcome back to the program. Well, I have a special guest this week. He's the incoming president of the Pennsylvania Medical Society, Dr. Charles Cutler. He's down there in Norristown, Pennsylvania. I've been there a few times. Welcome to the program.
Terry, thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's good to have you on. Well, we're going to talk to this controversial subject, medical marijuana, but before I do, I want to talk about Narcan. That's the brand name. Naloxone, I think, is the name that this drug goes by.
Generic.
Generic, yeah. And this is an important drug. Talk about why it's important first, and then we'll get into what happened this past week with Governor Wolf and the Secretary in terms of a position that the governor has taken. Go ahead. What does this drug do?
Terry, we have an opioid crisis, not only in Pennsylvania, but across the country. And this allows members of families, friends, interested people to carry and to have a product that should they come upon a person who has overdosed with an opioid, perhaps heroin, perhaps Percocet, various pills, that person will have a medication that they can instantly administer to a sick patient to reverse the effects of the opioid. It's a life-saving opportunity for members of the Pennsylvania Commonwealth, and I applaud Physician General Levine and Governor Wolf for allowing this to go forward and for giving all of the citizens in Pennsylvania the opportunity to save more lives.
Now, is this drug, how do you get a hold of that, of Narcan? How do you get it? If our viewer out there says, well, gee, I better get this, how do I do that?
Well, it couldn't be easier. You simply go to a pharmacy.
Really? You don't need a prescription?
And that is the entire point of this action, that now it's easily available. It's been available to physicians by prescription for years. But now, as I said earlier, any interested person in Pennsylvania who feels that they have friends, family members, or perhaps work in an occocupation, maybe on a college campus, where they may be dealing with someone who has...
That's an interesting point. I have to see where all that stands with the more than 100 colleges that we have, particularly in Pennsylvania, and I'm sure, given what the governor's standing order and how that's going to work out, that's something that we ought to pay more attention to. Yeah, I didn't realize that, first of all, I've talked to police informally, when you run into them in various places, and I would bring that up because I'm on a college campus where there's a lot of students hopefully not using drugs. And the question would be, what about heroin? Epidemic. That's all I hear.
Across the country, this is true. Terry, the number of overdoses is increasing exponentially. The number of people dying from opioid use or misuse is increasing exponentially. So we have to take action. And I think what Governor Wolf has done is extraordinary. It will save lives, and it'll make
it's an important,
our citizens healthier than they had been before.
All right, let's hold the medical marijuana. Let's run to a quick break, and then that'll give us a long time to get into a discussion about the society's position on it and what's going on with medical marijuana bill in the legislature that has something of a chance of passage. We'll be back in a moment.
This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is brought to you by the Pennsylvania Medical Society. Inspired physicians committed to the good health of Pennsylvanians and the advancement of the practice of medicine, and by the Pennsylvania Healthcare Association, the future of long-term care. This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is brought to you by the Pennsylvania Business Council and by the Pennsylvania Business Council Education Foundation.
Welcome back with the incoming president of the Pennsylvania Medical Society, Dr. Charles Cutler. He's my special guest. We talked about Narcan. Now we're going to shift to medical marijuana. Bill has passed the House or the Senate last session. It passed the Senate this session. It's somewhat controversial. 23 states have now done it. Now, Doctor, let's talk about the Medical Society. You have some concerns about this. Let's go through what those concerns are.
Well, the Pennsylvania Medical Society, Terry, is an evidence-based organization, and we're going to follow the science. And unfortunately, the science on marijuana, using it for medicinal reasons, is not well documented. One of the problems we have in Pennsylvania is that the FDA scheduled marijuana as a Category 1 drug in 1970. So for nearly a generation, there's been virtually no well-researched scientific study on marijuana. being a Scheduled I drug puts marijuana in the same class as heroin and LSD, a class that says there is no medical use for those products. Now, in my view, and in the view of many physicians, scheduling marijuana as a Category 1 drug is wrong.
It's a mistake, right.
And it's prevented us as a medical community from doing research.
On what level does that make sense? Not to have the research.
But,
or am I wrong about that?
We think this is the wrong place for marijuana to be. It should be reclassified. And if we can get it reclassified, and one of the goals of the Pennsylvania Medical Society is to advocate in Washington that the FDA change the classification. Once it's changed to a different scheduled drug, we can do research on it, just like every other product out there that has medicinal benefit. There is some soft information about using marijuana for medical reasons, but it's very poorly researched. Some of it is done in different countries where the standards are not up to what the standards are in the United States, and there are some individual case reports about benefit of marijuana. But those case reports simply don't give us the information that we need from a randomized, controlled, double-blinded study. We need to compare marijuana with a placebo so that we know that, in fact, when patients report that they're improved or feeling better, that it's really from the product and not from some placebo effect.
That is really surprising, given the fact that we have several states now that now have legalized recreational marijuana. 23 states have medicinal marijuana. And there's obviously a lot of pressure to do this. I mean, there's been riveting and very emotional testimony in the state legislature for it. But in some ways, I'm pretty stunned that we've gone through several decades and we don't know the long-term behavioral, healthcare effects of it. That's actually stunning to me.
Well, if you look at Senate Bill 3, which was passed in the Senate to allow marijuana for medicinal use, it creates an entire business infrastructure of growers, processors, sellers, boards to monitor marijuana. So there's a business model here that is perhaps driving the Pennsylvania Senate, and it may be in effect in other states. But in fact, medicinal use of marijuana, the evidence simply doesn't exist.
Well, I mean, one of the things, I think it's one thing, in the recreational that, we don't want to send folks to prison, users, small users, have a few ounces. That's a completely different subject than what you're talking about when you're interested in long-term behavioral effects. Thanks for coming on. You'll come back and you'll do some updates. All right, we'll see you next week for another edition of Pennsylvania Newsmakers. And as always, stay well.